National Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this morning to NUPI and to this half-day conference on ASEM. This is a co-organized event between NUPI and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We'd like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their support and encouragement and the cooperation. Now, ASEM is, as I guess all of you, or at least some of you know, is the Asia-Europe meeting. It brings together countries from Asia and from Europe. I think it's composed by 51 countries, 53 countries, 51 countries and 2 organizations. And at least it constitutes around 60% of the world population, around 60% of world GDP, and around 60% of world trade. So that should be fairly easy to remember. 60%, 3 times 20. And it was established at first in 1996 based on a very simple idea. The idea that Europe is important for Asia, and Asia is very important for Europe. It's an intergovernmental organization. It's an informal organization, makes no binding decisions, but it aims to promote somehow equal partnership and exchange of ideas. It's multidimensional in the sense that it addresses lots of different topics, and it is a combination of high-level meetings between decision makers. It involves a parliamentary dimension, and it's, the purpose is also to promote a people-to-people exchange. And I think that our meeting today tries to kind of fit into all of these things. We have high-level, distinguished speakers coming to us from with the State Secretary Marianne Hagen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have the whole ASEM delegation from the Norwegian Parliament with us today. And we have some distinguished speakers. I'll return to that later on. And of course, we have a fantastic crowd. The key issue on the ASEM agenda are related to connectivity, trade and investment, climate change, but also broader security challenges, such as counterterrorism, migration, maritime security, and cyber issues, etc. Norway joined ASEM in 2012. It's not an EU country, as you know, Norway, although we are very closely associated with the EU. And for Norway, ASEM has become an important platform, I think, for our engagement with Asian countries, and also a platform for engaging with our European partners in how to deal with Asian countries and economies. Now, the topic of today's workshop is connectivity. Connectivity is a buzzword over time. Trade and infrastructure projects are booming in Asia, and we also see lots of efforts and attempts at bridging Europe and Asia together. And one of the most foremost initiatives in this respect is the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese-led initiative. Now, we have brought together, I think, a strong group of experts to shed light on these topics. And we will have 3 prepared speeches, each talking for around 20 minutes or so, I guess. The first will be Yun Sun. As some of you might know, she visited NUPI in 2016, talking about the Russia-China relationship, but she's a senior associate with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Glad you're here, Yun Sun. And then she will be followed by Teresa Fallon. She's a Brussels-based analyst, writer and commentator on global energy and geopolitics. And she has also established a think tank in Brussels called the Center for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies. I don't know if Teresa has arrived yet. I don't think so, but hopefully she will be here soon. If not, then we have a perfect substitute. Then we will let Arne Melchior, a senior economist, he will then talk before Fallon. And Arne is, as some of you know, good economist, trade economist, and he has worked a lot on also on the impact on of Asia on global economy, and also how Norway is associated with and benefits from trade with Asian economies. And then we plan to have a coffee break at around 10:30, followed by a general discussion led by our colleague here at NUPI, Hans-Jørgen Gåsmyr. But before we start this set of speeches, it's a great honor to first hear some introductory remark by State Secretary Marianne Hagen. She will also open this event then, formally, and her remark then will be followed by Elin Rodum Agdestein, some remarks from her. She's leading the parliamentary delegation. She's a member of the parliament. She's been a member of the parliament since 2013. From the Conservative Party, Høyre, representing Nord-Trøndelag. So that's it. Just one final piece of information. As you know, there's restrooms and coffee will be served in the room back here where you had your breakfast. And I also should also inform you that this seminar will be streamed on YouTube. So we welcome all our global audience as well. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Marianne Hagen for her introductory remarks. Thanks. I should say, Marianne has told me that she has to leave right around 10 o'clock.
Quarter to.
So this, thank you so much for, and that's due to other obligations.
Thank you. Dear host, dear members of the ASEM delegation from Stortinget to the ASEM Parliamentary Partnership. Dear friends of ASEM, good morning to all of you. And thank you, Director Sverdrup, for your warm welcome and for arranging such an interesting seminar. Among our excellent speakers, there are also some that have traveled far to be here today. And we all look forward to listening to your presentations and the discussions to follow. At the outset, let me also underline how highly the Foreign Ministry appreciates the cooperation it enjoys with NUPI. NUPI's work is consistently of high quality. But in addition to that, NUPI plays a very important role in being an active contributor to foreign policy discussions and policy making in Norway. For this, we thank you. And turning to the topic of today's seminar, I'm sure that everybody in this room would agree that the rise in Asia is the most dramatic change the world economy has seen in the last 4 decades. Asia's impressive economic growth presents tremendous opportunities. Asian countries have gained considerable economic and political influence on the global stage. They are also our natural partners. As Ulf just said, together Europe and Asia today represent 60% of the global population, 60% of global production, and 60% of global trade. And the potential is there for even to grow even further. For more than 20 years, leaders from across Europe and Asia have gathered regularly to find ways to cooperate better in addressing the challenges that we face. We call this the Asia-Europe meeting, and this is what we celebrate here today. Today, also as Sverdrup said, ASEM includes 53 countries and institutional partners. And now we know that the institutional partners are 2. Norway has been one of the more recent members of ASEM. It has been long been a key priority for Norway to establish closer relations, political and trade relations with individual countries and with regional institutions in Asia. This is why we joined ASEM in 2012 as the only non-EU European member besides Switzerland. Please. And this is why in 2015 we became a sectoral dialogue partner with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Both are unique partnerships. The fact that Norway was invited to join these platforms, I take as a recognition of our widespread and active bilateral engagements in Asia, as well as recognition of the fact that we have ideas and concrete contributions to make to this form of multilateral cooperation. We are well aware of, however, that these relations also create expectations and the potential that we are yet to fully utilize. It will remain an ongoing task to ensure that Norway is relevant to Asian states and that we understand the dynamics and the possibilities we face in this region. This is why the Foreign Ministry took the initiative to celebrate ASEM-day. This afternoon, we organized the first meeting in an interministerial working group on ASEM matters, as a coordination and contact point for all our government as a whole uses the ASEM platform in the best possible manner for dialogue with Asia and Europe, to follow the development in Europe's cooperation, EU's cooperations with Asia, and to follow the developments in Asia in itself. This is also why we asked NUPI to host today's seminar. We need to learn more about the developments in Asia, about their implications for our own region and for the interlinkages between the two regions. Today's topic is high on the ASEM agenda: how to achieve not only better connectivity, but to make it sustainable and equally beneficial for all people. In Myanmar last November, Foreign Minister Ine Eriksen Søreide discussed a number of global and regional matters with her colleagues at the ASEM Foreign Ministers meeting. The dominant issue, of course, was the Rohingya crisis, and Minister Eriksen Søreide delivered clear messages concerning the international community's expectations to the Myanmar government. On the more positive note, she also announced that Norway will be organizing an ASEM conference on sustainable shipping, together with Singapore, Germany, and the Philippines. This conference is called Green Shipping, Blue Business, Moving Forward Together, and will take place in Singapore on the 26th and 27th of April. It will provide an opportunity for authorities, businesses, and organizations from all ASEM countries to exchange practical experiences, solutions, ideas, and suggestions. The conference will also present prominent companies and research institutions. They will all offer ideas and solutions to how to succeed in the green transformation in the maritime sector. Our Minister of Climate and Environment, Mr. Ola Elvestuen, will open the conference together with the leaders of IMO and UNEP. The Norwegian government have ambitious environmental goals for the maritime industry. At the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, Prime Minister Erna Solberg announced the establishment of a international high-level panel on building a sustainable ocean economy. The initiative draws on Norway's expertise in this field, and the objective is to increase international understanding on how a sustainable ocean economy can play a key role in the world's most vital future needs. Sustainable growth and value creation are key objectives of Norway's maritime policy and crucial for the ocean economy at large. At the same time, green shipping is a focus area in Norway's environmental policy. Facilitating the development of new and environmentally friendly solutions at sea is a priority. Together, these are key elements in the Norwegian government's maritime strategy presented in 2015, as well as the recent launched ocean strategy. Norway has also launched a 150 million Norwegian crowns program aimed at combating marine litter and microplastics in the ocean in developing countries. Initially, the program will focus on Southeast Asia, which is the region where the problem is most acute. By promoting a green shift in all parts of the maritime industry, the Singapore conference will also contribute to the broader UN 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Since we joined Asia-Europe meeting in 2012, Norway has participated in 2 ASEM summits for heads of state and government. The summits alternate between Asia and Europe and takes place every 2nd year. The Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, plans to participate at the ASEM summit to be held in Brussels in October this year. Between the summits, similar meetings are held for foreign ministers. Norway has also taken part in the ASEM meetings for finance ministers and transport ministers, as well as in a number of expert meetings, including on human rights. Norway supports the work of the Asia-Europe Foundation, which supports the work of ASEM. We also currently have a national expert from our ministry working at the ASEM team of the EU's External Action Service, the EEAS. Dear friends of ASEM, in reality, Asia meets Europe every day. From Osaka to Oslo, from Naypyidaw to Naples, Asia matters to Europe, and Europe matters to Asia. The forms of interactions are multifaceted and grow in numbers every day, be it in products and services, tourism, student exchanges, the fight against terrorism or poverty, or achieving the UN 2030 agenda. And Norway greatly values the platform that ASEM provides for leaders and experts to meet. When Asia and Europe work together, we'll find good solutions for common challenges and make the most of our opportunities, being strong pillars for each other and strong supporters of a rules-based international order. This is what ASEM is all about. I once more thank Ulf Sverdrup and his colleagues for organizing this seminar. I also like to thank the chair of the Storting's delegation to the Asia-Europe Parliamentary Partnership, Elin Rodum Agdestein, and her colleagues in the delegation for being here today. The ministry greatly appreciates the active engagement of the Norwegian Parliament, and we look forward to receiving your input as we prepare for the ASEM Summit later this year. I wish you all an interesting morning, and thank you for your attention.
A very good morning to you all. Let me start by thanking NUPI for hosting this event today. From the Norwegian Parliament's point of view, we highly appreciate the Foreign Ministry's initiative to mark the ASEM-day. I say ASEM, it's too much of me, with an Asia seminar, and this takes place every March. My name is Elin Agdestein, and I am head of the Norwegian Parliament's delegation to the Asia-Europe Parliamentary Partnership, or ASEP, as it's commonly known. As Ulf said, the whole delegation is present here today. It's Helge André Njåstad from the Progress Party, and also Torstein Tveit Solberg from the Labour Party. So ASEP is like the parliamentary dimension, or the assembly to the governmental cooperation in the Asia-Europe meeting. With the geopolitical developments currently taking place, it's more important than ever to focus on Asia. As it was said, Asia is important to Europe and vice versa. This is also why the Norwegian Parliament decided to become a member of ASEP in 2015. It's only 3 years ago. And that is to increase the focus on relations with Asia in general, in accordance to being a part of the Parliamentary Assembly. So, as a current member of the Standing Committee on Finance and a former member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, I see an increasing need in Norway for more knowledge about Asia and its developments. It's China's foreign policy. It's the trade policies of ASEAN. It's the growing investment by our Global Investment Fund in Asian countries. All have consequences for the debates and decisions made in Parliament today. Connectivity is increasing, not only within Asia, but also between Asia and Europe. So we warmly welcome the title and the topic of today's seminar. We also see this increased interaction between the parliaments in our daily work. There are visits both ways to and from Asia, more focus in the international delegations on developments in the region, and there are all these specific agreements that require our parliamentary consent. As a parliament, we also follow closely the ongoing political developments and the trade negotiations taking place between our government and China. And this year, there's already been several visits on parliamentary level between our two countries. And there are more to come in the pipeline. We hope China will take not only a bilateral role, but also a multilateral role. For a small country like Norway, this would be a major bonus. During his recent visit to Beijing, the Speaker of Norwegian Parliament, Mr. Olemic Thommessen, underlined the importance of this in his meetings with President Xi. The importance of cooperation between parliaments to expand understanding and knowledge was also discussed during the stay. With our increased engagement with Asia, we want to do exactly that from the Parliament also. We want to add an important parliamentary dimension to the work and negotiations taking place at governmental level. Taking part in an interparliamentary dialogue with Asia countries gives us the perfect opportunity to build and nurture personal contacts and to experience firsthand the way in which Asian politicians view the global challenges. We have very recently decided to apply for observer status in the Interparliamentary Assembly of ASEAN, called the AIPA. And ever since Norway became a sector dialogue partner to ASEAN, that was in 2015, it's been a particular importance to us to focus on the ASEAN interparliamentary body. The collaboration and the priority plan for further strengthening the Norway-ASEAN relations has a broad support in our parliament. We believe that the permanent observer status in AIPA would add a crucial dimension to the cooperation between Norway and ASEAN, strengthening the dialogue between the parliaments on key issues within the priority plan. Great opportunities lie in increased connectivity within Asia and between ASEM countries in trade, mobility, green growth, and transition. So we very much look forward to learning more about that today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here again. I was here about a year and a half ago to talk about China-Russia relations. I'm originally from China. I have been home based in Washington, D.C. for about 15 years now. I visit China about 8 times a year. It's a lot of miles. And my focus is primarily on Chinese foreign policy. So what China does, what China wants, and how China gets it. That's how I simplify what I do. So today I was asked to focus on the motivation, the intention, and the implementation of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I'll try to present the story to the audience here from a different perspective that includes that of China and those from the recipient countries in different regions. And I'll leave it to my colleague Teresa to focus on the China-Europe perspective, and I'll primarily focus on China. So Belt and Road Initiative. As Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy campaign, the Belt and Road Initiative is a grand plan with the potential to change the geopolitics and also geoeconomics of the Eurasia and Asia-Pacific region in the coming decades. So when it was first proposed in China, it was actually proposed before Xi Jinping's ascension to power in late 2013. So when it was first proposed, the blueprint coincided with the strategic proposal in the wildly popular inside China, the so-called westward strategy, which advocated for China's own strategic rebalancing to the vast areas to the west of China in light of the enhanced strategic competition and contest with the United States in the East, especially in the West Pacific. So following Chairman Mao Zedong's mantra, where the enemy advances, we retreat. Where the enemy retreats, we advance. The Belt and Road Initiative, at its inception, was designed to improve China's strategic position vis-à-vis the United States through enhancing its presence and influence in Eurasia. The later conscious efforts by Beijing to downgrade the Belt and Road from a strategy to an initiative have been intentional. So it was designed to mitigate the suspicion, rejection, and hostility from potential partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. So compared to where it was 4.5 years ago, today, the geographical coverage of the initiative has expanded significantly to cover Asia, Europe, MENA, and Africa. In the past 4.5 years, China has dedicated a significant amount of resources to turn the initiative into many bilateral and sub-regional plans as well as projects. The logic is simple. The Belt and Road Initiative utilizes China's foreign reserves, which is quite huge, and industrial capacity to connect and integrate the regional economies in a cooperative manner. Geographically, it encompasses more than 60 countries in Eurasia. Economically, it seeks to reduce trade barriers through infrastructure connectivity projects, free trade agreements, and other trade facilitation measures. According to Chas Freeman, the former U.S. diplomat, the vast space between the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Pacific to the Middle East and the Indian Ocean is to be laced with industrial development project corridors that draw on these links to create centers of economic activities. Network effects assure benefits not just for China as a leader of the BRI, but to every country touched by it. So that probably represents the most positive reading and interpretation in the United States about the BRI. The economic significance of the initiative should be widely recognized. Given China's financial and industrial capacity, it could play a key role in creating economic opportunities and stimulating growth in participating countries. This would turn China into a provider of important public goods in the region. And if successful, the campaign could even have a long-term stabilizing effect in conflict-affected countries such as Afghanistan. Domestically in China, Belt and Road is widely regarded as a key policy to absorb the overcapacity of the Chinese domestic economy. It's not necessarily targeted at a foreign audience. As the Chinese market domestically is saturated, and the Chinese contractors, especially the state-owned enterprises, need new market opportunities, the developing countries along the Belt and Road Initiative are perceived to be the best possible candidates. Xi Jinping has envisioned the initiative to re-engineer China's strategic environment and project China's influence first through its economic power. BRI focuses on regions where U.S. dominance is less consolidated, and the economic rather than the political or security focus of the initiative has made it less prone to traditional zero-sum geopolitical interpretations. However, the strategic implications of the Belt and Road are much more deeply embedded in China's economic diplomacy and in the ensuing inspirational or coercive power of Chinese influence. China has been adeptly leveraging its economic statecraft to influence the policies and politics of recipient countries, and I think that's no strange or no news to European countries. Economic benefits such as investment, loans, and infrastructure projects have been used to motivate and reward China-friendly policies and actions. Equally important, as China's overseas economic engagements expand under the Belt and Road, they will introduce a natural and rising demand on China to protect its investment, assets, and personnel in politically less stable countries. So we know that China has established its first military base in Djibouti, although China doesn't call it a military base, they call it a Naval Logistical Support Center, based on claims of logistical needs for the Chinese naval escort missions, peacekeeping, and humanitarian missions in the region. So it is conceivable that China in the future will expand its direct security presence in other parts of the world in order to protect its Belt and Road projects. Although the strategic implications of BRI are widely recognized, the level and scope of its actual impact significantly depend on the success of the economic projects implemented under the Belt and Road. Because of the expensive nature of many of the initiative projects and the yet-to-be proven Chinese ability to effectively manage the challenges associated on the ground, some argue that the initiative's impact in the long run will be insignificant. China is still on a rather steep learning curve in terms of its domestic politics and the internal conflicts of many countries covered by the initiative. So, looking at a few examples, the political transformation in Myanmar, the domestic disturbances in Pakistan, or the failure of the Chinese commercial endeavors in Afghanistan, all should serve as expensive lessons for the Chinese government and Chinese investors. This is part of the reason why China is seeking Western countries' participation and contribution in the Belt and Road Initiative to spread the risks and to utilize Western knowledge and experience in local countries. As America and Europe both prioritize trade and exports, the Belt and Road Initiative could offer some lucrative opportunities to Western companies, especially if China wishes to sweeten ties with specific governments. However, how to manage the discrepancy between short-term economic gains and the long-term implications of Western support of what is essentially a Chinese campaign to promote the Chinese strategic influence remains to be a major question. So these are my arguments about China's intention and the motivation behind the Belt and Road Initiative. But now we are 4.5 years into the Belt and Road. How about the implementation? Let's give an overview as for how it has been received or how it has been going on in most of the countries that have received Belt and Road Initiative funding or their projects. So considering the domestic economic background of the Belt and Road, meaning that China is using Belt and Road to primarily promote the export of Chinese service and Chinese products to absorb its overcapacity. Connectivity projects, especially infrastructure connectivity projects, has been a primary direction or focus of the Belt and Road. And in China, most, if not all, of the foreign investment or foreign economic cooperation projects have been labeled or have been categorized in certain categories of the Belt and Road, including infrastructure projects and non-infrastructure projects. So there's a political and economic convenience to it for the Chinese players. So having a project labeled Belt and Road project facilitates the funding and the approval process inside the Chinese bureaucracy. So as for the specific implementation, Belt and Road basically radiates from China in a concentric circle kind of manner. So it starts with mainland China, then to Asia, and then more broadly into the rest of the world. So it is reasonable for the regions in China's neighborhood to have received more attention and resources for the Belt and Road. And if we look at basically across in the Chinese periphery, first of all, there is Central Asia. Central Asia has been almost the most important and most successful case of the Belt and Road projects. So China has been trying to establish its China, Central Asia, Europe transportation corridor. And so far, they have been successful with a cargo train system between the eastern coastal area of China to Almaty, to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is the one country that has received the most funding under the Belt and Road Initiative among all the countries. So there's also the from Sichuan province through Xinjiang, through Kazakhstan to Europe, from Wuhan province to Europe, and from Henan province to Europe. So Central Asia is one area that China has also built sporadic train systems in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So if you ask the Chinese policy makers that which region has been most successful in terms of concrete implementation, Central Asia is usually raised as the example. Then there's Northeast Asia because of the impact of the Korean Peninsula situation and because of the deterioration of Sino-Japanese relations. So Northeast Asia, I would say, is one region in Asia that has received the least attention in terms of Belt and Road Initiative. The Japanese government is trying to enhance its participation or its cooperation with China starting from late last year. And they have proposed funding for Japanese companies to participate in some of the Belt and Road projects. But so far, there has not been any concrete development on that, in that regard. But in Northeast Asia, the cooperation with Russia could be one interesting area, but we have to see the concrete result coming out of that relationship. We know that in terms of the Sino-Russia cooperation on Belt and Road, there are two primary directions. One direction is to the north, so through the Northern Passage. And in the most recent elaboration of the Chinese statement on the Polar Silk Road, the Northern Passage and the cooperation with Russia to build ports and build transportation infrastructure through through Siberia to the Arctic region is one priority for China. The other strategic direction with Russia is to the west of China, through Xinjiang. And the most famous project that has been constantly discussed is the Moscow-Kazan high-speed railway. But we also know that as of October of 2017, there still has been this major disagreement between China and Russia as to how the funding scheme of this railway will look like. And Russia seems to be resistant to the idea of the Chinese financing proposal, which indicated higher interest rates that Moscow is unwilling to accept. So there are signs of positive development and a lot of areas being discussed, but as for the concrete development of the Belt and Road through Russia, we have to see. In terms of Southeast Asia, there are a couple of railways. There's a Sino-Laos Railway that was first proposed in 2010, took them about 5 years to negotiate. And now the construction is underway. There is a Sino-Thailand Railway. Again, lengthy discussion and lengthy debate as for what the interest rate should look like. But now currently the first phase of that railway is under construction. There is also this, the Chinese most famous or most proud of, this Indonesia high-speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung. This deal was signed about 3 years ago. But as of last month, the construction or the development of that railway is still yet to take place. So some of the Indonesian government officials have acknowledged that the domestic factors were the main reason that this implementation has been delayed. But it is safe to say that in Southeast Asia, there are some successful cases of Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects being implemented. But in most cases, there have been negativities associated with the Chinese investment and local resistance. In South Asia, among all the countries, CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is probably the only one that can still be worthy called successful, or halfly successful. So CPEC has been labeled, even in China, as a flagship project for Belt and Road, and it indicates how much attention and how much importance Beijing has attached to it. And the total investment is speculated to be around $60 billion, so it's quite large. But I would say that now in China, the estimate is that if China will spend about 50% or fulfill 50% of its commitment, they will see that as successful. But Pakistan has its own problems, and now the joke is that if China breaks it, then China has to buy it. And it's a question as if China is willing to buy it. And then in terms of the port development, which is a part of the Maritime Silk Road rather than the land New Silk Road initiative, across Southeast Asia and South Asia, there are a couple of examples. There's Gwadar, which China built to begin with, but now China is also managing it. There's Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Again, China built it a long time ago, but now the Sri Lankan government has given Hambantota the management and the lease to China, to Chinese companies, because it had been consistently losing money. There is also another deep sea port called Jiaopiu in the coastal area in Rakhine State of Myanmar. The deal was signed about 3 years ago, but the implementation is still yet to take place in Myanmar because of concerns that I will discuss later. So last but not least, in the African region, it's interesting, why should Belt and Road include Africa? At the beginning, Belt and Road Initiative did not include Africa, but in the past 3 years, the Chinese companies gradually inserted a lot of projects in Africa into the Belt and Road basket. So far, there have been 3 successful transportation infrastructure projects completed in Africa. There's the Mombasa-Nairobi's high-speed railway. There's the Abuja-Kaduna railway in Nigeria. And there's also the Addis Ababa to Djibouti railway in Africa. So if we look across the board at the implementation of Belt and Road Initiative in these regions, I would say that in Central Asia, there has been a higher percentage of successfully completed and implemented projects. In Southeast Asia, sporadic or specific projects are smooth, but even the negotiation took a very long time. But in all, it has not been particularly smooth. If you look at China's relationship with Vietnam, with Myanmar, and the discussion or the debate that China has to go through in Thailand and in Indonesia. In South Asia, CPEC is almost the only successful example. In Africa, the railway system or the railway projects has been roughly successful, but the undetermined issue is that whether China in the future will be able to get its investment back, because there's no guarantee that the railway operation in these countries are going to generate enough revenue. And in the case of Northeast Asia, especially Russia, I would say that the development has been slow, and China does not expect immediate concrete result coming out of the cooperation on Belt and Road with Russia now. So the concern across the board among the recipient countries of Belt and Road funding from China is the impact of Chinese funding or Chinese projects over the long-term security of the recipient countries. And there are 2 types of security that they're primarily concerned about. One is financial security. The other one is national security. So China's logic, like we talked earlier, is that China will provide the loans to hire Chinese contractors to build infrastructure for the local recipient governments. So to meet the Chinese ambition, and we know that China has been very ambitious, the size of the projects and the loans have been exceedingly large compared to what the local governments would need otherwise. So in China's design, that China is building these projects to suffice or to meet with a Chinese strategic blueprint. So for the size or the scale of the railway, of the number of railway stations, or the size of the port, or the size of the special economic zones or industrial zones, the Chinese design usually fit or meet with what the Chinese envision that should meet with the Chinese scale of economy. But most of the recipient countries along the Belt and Road, they do not have such a large economic ambition. So the question for the recipient countries is why or whether they should borrow money from China to provide business opportunities to Chinese contractors and to support what is essentially Chinese strategic ambitions through their country. So in the case of Thailand and Myanmar, you would hear the central governments asking the question that if this is a Chinese strategic ambition, then China should build it for free. Why should we borrow money from China to implement the Chinese ambition, right? And that explains a lot of the delays and a lot of the lengthy negotiation between China and the recipient countries, including the case of the Moscow-Kazan high-speed railway. So if the local recipient governments, they do want the infrastructure, and the Chinese, they do offer 2 options. The first option is that for the recipient country to take out more money of its own as a buy-in, so the recipient governments will have a higher stake, a higher percentage of ownership in the project. And the second option is that they don't have to spend as much money to have a high percentage of ownership, and they can let the Chinese have a higher stake in the project. So in the first scenario, since a lot of the recipient governments will have to borrow loans from China as a buy-in anyway, so the country is faced with a long-term debt issue, that whether the debt sustainability of these infrastructure projects is actually there. And in the second case, the Chinese will just have direct ownership. So that raises a lot of concerns, especially in developing countries, about either the financial security or their national security, or both, that are associated with Belt and Road infrastructure projects. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to this discussion later. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And then it's my pleasure to introduce Teresa Falmouth. Thank you so much.
Do I have
You have everything?
Okay, is this the clicker here?
I think so. Just to check if it's... Yes, it works.
Okay, thanks, wonderful. Good morning, I apologize. It was one of these horrible mornings. I'm 5 minutes away and I was walking around in a circle for 30 minutes, so you really can't trust GPS. No, it's my fault. I think I got lost in a paper bag. Let's see. Okay, just make sure we got here. And thank you, Yun-san, for agreeing to go first and giving me a chance to acclimatize to the room. So it's really an honor to be here. I was in Oslo about 3 years ago for a RIMPAC talk, and I remember adding an extra day and I managed to come here, so I never dreamed I'd be up on the stage today speaking, so I'm really honored to be here. I was trying to relate to the audience here. That's how I felt today. I felt my pole was broken. Who's going to save me? So I was a college student at the time, so we had to, all right, here we go. That really, I didn't know that was going to happen today, that I'd be so late. Okay, here we go. So how many of you are familiar with ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting? Oh, okay, great, so I don't have to spend, okay, that's great, because March 1st was ASEM-day. So I'll briefly talk about ASEM and connectivity, European perspective on the Belt and Road Initiative. Yun-san gave a wonderful presentation on that, so I hope I won't repeat anything that you laid out so clearly. And then future prospects. Okay. So as I said, March 1st was ASEM-day. We had a big celebration at the European Parliament. It's not that big, is it? So we're trying to get more people involved, more interested. It was established in 1996 because it felt that Europe was becoming less connected to Asia. So it was a way, it's very informal and to bring them together. Okay, so there's 53 partners, 60% of the world population, 60% of the world GDP, 60% of global trade, so the whole 666 thing going on there. But it kind of lines up a lot with what we were talking about, the Belt and Road Initiative. So there seems to be some natural synchronicity there, but there are also challenges. So foreign policy making laboratories since 1996. It's not institutionalized, it's very informal. They don't have a bank attached to it like the AIIB, but they have a lot of meetings, as you can see. But it's important for them to, they have 50% of Asia's exports go to Europe, 50% of Asia's imports come from Europe, and as you can see, this is all the ASEM kind of publicity material. But on this final slide here, these are the things that they want to focus on: environment, climate change, migration, and counterterrorism. So there's not a lot there about connectivity, is there? So back in November, they had their meeting, and it takes a long time. Things do move slowly, but they have ironed out the definition of connectivity. Now, this is kind of a briefer version because it's extremely long. So I suggest that you go online and look at it because I didn't want to bore you with all of the long definition, but this is progress. It took a long time to even get the definition of the term. Okay, that's not, okay. So ASEM is a possibility. It's one of the biggest organizations in the world, and the United States isn't in it. So the countries in it actually have a lot of power in that sense, and China's very interested in kind of helping it along the way and trying to steer it. We've even seen some competition between China and Japan for important roles on panels. So we can see this kind of competition and who wants to lead it, and of course the European Union wants to help shape it as well. So we see these interesting competition of values and norms going on right now. So this is just, so I'm going to talk now about the Belt and Road because ASEM is getting off slowly about connectivity, but I'm going to look right now at the Belt and Road and then look at challenges and then the European perspective. All right, so you can see this is the official banner. It's red. There's something right there in the corner. They're not hiding it. It's got a song. It's got a dance. What are they holding? What are they holding in their hands? It's an abacus, because everyone's going to shake their abacus and make money on the Belt and Road. This was a dance. There was a performance put on in Brussels. So there's kind of telling everybody you're going to make money on the Belt and Road. So all roads do lead to Europe. We have to get through Central Asia first, but all roads do lead to Europe. So that's an important aspect of China's strategy for it. Okay, so at the European Parliament, they have many events on this. And Jing Men from the College of Europe declared China's Belt and Road is ambiguous and ambitious. And that immediately made Europe more nervous because when something's so unclear, they're and Europe is more of a rules-based. We have everything clarified first, and then we work down, whereas China, or work up, and China's kind of like, we have this great strategy, please embrace it. So there's been a problem right from the start from two different aspects. All right, and these are the corridors. I'm just going to pour a glass of water. Ooh. Okay. Yun-sen mentioned them, so I just think sometimes it's good to visualize it, because when we say Belt and Road, we always think of one, but it's not. And there are multiple ones. Some are more successful than others. And she went into detail about CPEC, which is probably the most important one for China in terms of strategic issues. Okay, so the European perspective on this. All right, so EU-Asia relations. EU is China's largest trading partner. It's also the largest foreign investor in ASEAN. EU has interesting ties with ASEAN. And EU's foreign policy interests require the safety of European commerce with Asia. So anything happens in this region, it could hurt European trade, especially on the maritime routes. So here's a map. I mean, there's all sorts of stories that China doesn't want to release any more maps about the Belt and Road, because as soon as you release the map, then people start looking at it and wondering what's going on. For example, there's a map where the maritime Silk Road goes to Calcutta in India, and the Indians went ballistic about that because they said that they weren't going to participate in it. So these maps are becoming very, very political. But this one is one I found recently of the rail routes. And Yun-sen mentioned it. So OBOR is One Belt, One Road. Some call it One Belt, One Way, because there's been a big issue of subsidizing these trains. It's not very economic. These trains go from Yiwu in China or different parts of China to Europe, but then they're put empty on a ship back to China. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of economic sense. So a lot of economists are wondering, why are they doing this? What's the purpose behind this? And others call it OBOT, One Belt, One Trap. So they're trying to understand what's really behind this. And cost. Cost is a big issue. You know, look how many, this is just to give you an idea of, these modern mega container ships can carry so much for such a low cost compared to the trains. So, and it's 5 times more expensive to send it by train, by rail, and also it's far more polluting. And there's many different quotes, but I just thought I'd choose this one. Given the Chinese subsidies for the, I'm not going to remember this now, but it's the overland route, are rumored to be as high as 50%. The true economic cost of trans-Eurasian rail freight may equal that of shipping the same cargo by air. So these arguments that it's actually less expensive to send it by rail rather than by air doesn't even exist. So in some cases, so it's very questionable. Is it public diplomacy? Is it strategic messaging? What's behind these routes? Okay, so that's the end of the part about rail. Excuse me. What are the opportunities for Europe? There are 5 areas that China wants to focus on. So financial cooperation and integration. So China's very interested in getting the renminbi. We saw with Britain joining the AIIB, one of the deals was that they would have a renminbi hub in London. That was a key factor in their decision to join. And it would decrease over-reliance on the U.S. dollar and promote greater liquidity and stability if the renminbi really is going to remain stable. A famous analyst has described the Chinese market. They were looking at graphs of how the Chinese market is behaving, and Paul Chenao said that it's like a pig on LSD. You just don't know which way it's going to run next. So it's very, very hard to predict. It doesn't seem to be making a lot of sense. Ooh. Oh no, now I've lost it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so institutional cooperation, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the AIIB, so they have these joint projects together, the European Investment Bank, and fill Eurasian infrastructure financing gaps and support EU connectivity. So EU has had projects for a long time looking at connectivity in Eurasia. Is this a natural bridge between China's projects and European projects? I keep doing the same thing. Okay, there we go. And then challenges for Europe. There's a lot of suspicion about this 16+1. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states, and China. So this makes Brussels very, very nervous because Chinese leaders go to Central and Eastern European countries, and we've seen with, for example, the arbitral tribunal decision in regard to Philippines versus China. because of these investments. And they're not very deep investments, but these investments are actually an enticement for these states to kind of vote towards Chinese policies. So we saw in this specific example, Hungary and Croatia had a maritime dispute with Slovenia, but it was really Hungary and Greece who held out. And the statement, instead of welcoming the arbitral tribunal decision that said that Philippines had won the 15 points, they actually just acknowledged it. So this came as a big shock to the rest of the democracies or the G7, because the G7 had issued a statement in support of this, but Europe was unable to because of these countries that kind of held out. And Europe, all right, 2 years ago, the EUGS, a European Global Strategy, was released. It was released one day after the Brexit announcement, so maybe you didn't see it in the press very much. It just got buried after 2 years of writing and drafting. It really got very little coverage because it was overshadowed by Brexit. But they're trying, and I think it's improving. It's slow, everything's slow, but they're making some improvements, and they're ABC. America right now is in bad shape. Brexit and China. These are things that are helping Europe kind of grow their geostrategic vision. Okay, so there, like ASEM, there's limited awareness of OBOR in Europe, and there's no links to strategy for foreign and security policy. But we're seeing there, if you go online, you can actually write your contribution. You can give your input. They're coming up with a shepherding report on it. They don't want to say it's in response to the Belt and Road, but it's kind of, they want to craft a policy response to what's happening in their own neighborhood. And in other words, it's kind of responding to China's Belt and Road. But they really want to come up with their own vision, their own views. So you can go online and send your comments, and they should be heard and hopefully implemented in their paper, which is going to come out in June or July. That's the deadline. Okay, so Chinese economic statecraft. Yun mentioned some of these things in her presentation, so I won't spend too much time on it. How do I define it? It's defined as using economic resources, foreign aid, trade sanctions, strategic investments, and I would even say tourism, to influence policy decisions in other countries. This is the year of China-Europe tourism, and we've seen it in the past when countries had a problem with China, for example, the Philippines or Taiwan. China sends no more tourists there, and that really makes a big difference to these countries' economies. All right, so we mentioned earlier about the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. There are many countries in Europe. 14 of the EU 28 member states originally joined. More are joining. For example, Hungary had a little bit of a misunderstanding. They thought it was the ADB, Asia Development Bank. They thought they had already joined, so they missed the deadline. And China was very upset with them. So the next round, they applied and they got in, and they're a special status, because if you came in later, you had different rules. So Hungary's at a very special status. They joined late, but they have the same package as if they had joined at the beginning. All right, so are there diverging economic interests, potentially increasing trade imbalances between Europe and China? What are the investment priorities? So China wants certain projects, Europe might want other projects. How do they work that out? And the issue of conditionality. All right, so Yun was talking about rail links and hubs. I'm going to just look at one specific example in Europe. We know about, you might be familiar with Piraeus. Can you hear me okay? Piraeus is the Greek port that China has invested in. I mean, it's incredible. At first I asked other economists, I said, can this figure be correct? Last year they said they improved their income by 92%. I mean, that's amazing. So I said, was it that Greece was so bad, China's so good, or someone's fudging the figures? And they said it's a little bit of all those things. But it's really remarkable. It was modernized, and at the same time, Germany had encouraged Greece to sell it, and the IMF as well. So now there's almost this kind of seller's remorse, like, what have we done? China has a big impact in this region. Greece is kind of siding with China on a lot of these issues. We saw Greece, for the first time ever, Europe was unable to submit the document to the UN about human rights. So Greece voted against that. So Europe is kind of having different policy issues because of these types of investments. So the initial investment is in Piraeus, and they want to build a railway. It goes through a non-member state or possible accession state, Serbia. So it's easier for China to build things there. But when it goes to Hungary, Hungary has to follow EU rules. And so this project has been stalled because Hungary just kind of accepted the bid. Europe always feels they get shortchanged because they have huge amounts of structural funds. Sometimes they can give them out at zero interest. Why would they, a country like Hungary, take on loans to China when they could get EU structural funds? That seems to be the question back in Brussels. And some economists, I haven't done the figures myself, had said Hungary, it will take them 2,700 years to pay back the loan. That seems like quite a long time. And in Hungary, there's a lot of domestic anger about this. It's not just that the government is getting away with this. Sun mentioned Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Well, this is another case where they took on so much debt and were unable to pay it back. Some economists have called it debt trap diplomacy because China said, don't worry about that. Just sign it over for 99 years. So it's kind of a reverse of what happened to Hong Kong. So the Chinese are coming in, offering loans. These countries accept them. They can't pay them back. And then it's like debt for equity. They get the land for 99 years. So I think Brussels is very, very concerned about this. And this is really on ice right now. So this is called the Trans-Serbian Express. Originally it was advertised that it would be a high-speed rail. So it's been downgraded to just an upgrade of rail line between Serbia and Croatia. The rail exists. It's 85% financed by a 20-year loan from China. China is motivated by prospect of transporting Chinese goods from Greek docks of Piraeus to Western Europe. So this is put on hold. So, everyone's becoming more and more suspicious now. At first, everyone was kind of interested, maybe embracing it, but when these things happen, they're getting worried. We saw the same thing in the Maldives and Djibouti. So I got a little ahead of myself. So this is the slide for debt trap diplomacy. But we've seen it in Laos. We've seen it in other countries along the Belt and Road. So maybe you've heard the term white elephant. White elephant's like a big project that you invest in. And so people along the way in Georgia, for example, are calling them red elephants. These projects, as Yun had mentioned, if you just said, I have a Belt and Road project, you could get money in the early days. It was very easy as long as, and Georgia, for example, was a country originally on the Belt and Road. So they got a lot of funds, and there are huge projects there, and no one's living in them, and they're just empty. So there's been a lot of lack of resource allocation along the way. Some have estimated 190 billion in bad loans, but we don't really even know. Okay, so investment. So the Belt and Road Initiative, everyone wants money. I mean, no one's going to say no to money, right? So this is I think this was the inflection point in Europe, because when the graph starts going like this, for Chinese investments and European investments start going down, I think that kind of set off alarm bells, because European businesses are doing pretty well in China, or they were. So it was very difficult to get anybody to talk about foreign direct investment screening mechanism. In the US, I call it CFI. It's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US. And people would ask me, would there ever be a CFIU? Well, 2 years ago, no one would even dream of a CFIU. Now that has changed. So it's a big sea change, I would say, in European perspectives. This gives you an idea of where Chinese foreign direct investment is going. And you can see in Central and Eastern Europe, it doesn't take a lot. And the best thing about those places are that they don't ask for reciprocity. They don't have companies that want to go back to China and do business. So it's an easy place to invest. It doesn't take a lot, and they don't need reciprocity. Whereas the bigger countries, say, well, our car industry wants more rights. We don't want to have to give you our technology when we come here for business. Okay, and then this gives you an idea where the money matters the most. So according to their ratio of GDP. And Portugal is a very interesting place, but that would be another discussion. So, and this is Luxembourg, so thank you. And Finland, okay. Okay, so this is, you can see the foreign direct investment in the 28 by entry mode. So it's really ramped up dramatically from nothing to, this is just up to 2015. Okay, this was the Belt and Road, the Central and Eastern Europe, just to give you an idea. These are the 28 member states. This is out of order, those, I don't know how that happened. Okay, so there is a growing concern about Chinese investment in Europe. Chinese political influence, as I mentioned earlier, gave you some examples about Greece. Hungary, control of assets of relevance to national security. Some reports have stated that there isn't a single port in Europe that there isn't some Chinese investment. So China, you don't see it on the maps, you don't see all these, but China has invested in every single port around Europe's periphery. So it's really, really fascinating. From a very short period of time, they've been able to do that. Corporate ties to the CCP can be regarded as potential strategic implications of having received Chinese investment. Okay. So I call it an inflection point. So when did this happen? I would say the KUKA sale. There are 12 robotics companies in Germany. China's investment patterns have shifted over the last 2 years. The high technology that they can't get in the US because of CFIUS, they kind of focus on Europe. And KUKA was the #1 robotics company in Germany. They have like incredible robotic arms. They had an ad on television where, on YouTube, where a robotic arm is playing ping pong with the world's best ping pong player. And the Chinese were like, I got to get that company. So, but within 2 months, the company that bought it is called Medea. Within 2 months, because of the civil military structure in China, German engineers are designing things for the People's Liberation Army of China, the PLA. So Extron was a chip manufacturer, also in Germany, and it was that deal got ended because of they had a subsidiary in California, and President Obama said when he was still in office that that deal couldn't go through. So Germany was almost like, thank you, because we don't want to have to say no to China because the German businesses will be penalized. So it was nice that someone could carry the can for them. So this idea of kind of having others say no, not your own country, that's why my view is that finally there will be a CFIU, but because of the investments in Europe already, it will be too difficult to have something with teeth. So it will have one key benefit. If there is an organization that even has to review things, they can say, China, we would love to sell you this X company, but Brussels won't let me. This is one of the key factors of having this, and this is what will happen. It's like what happened with the arms embargo. China would go to each member state, please lift the arms embargo. They, well, yes, I would love to, but Brussels won't let me. So this is kind of this functional use of Brussels, which President Juncker hates, but it does have some benefits. And then all EU member states now have a trade deficit with China, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the 16+1. So can the EU speak with one voice anymore? We've seen it very fractured. It's very, very difficult. It's like herding cats. It's always been difficult, but it's becoming more difficult with Chinese investments. So China is able to divide and rule, and we see these sub-regions. We mentioned the 16+1, but as soon as you name something, then people pay more attention to it. So there's some carving out, but the Chinese aren't giving them names. Nordic countries and Mediterranean countries. But people are watching this closely. So these sub-regional groupings make Brussels rather nervous. Okay, so a divided Europe is seen as an additional opportunity. Chinese scholars expect Brexit will weaken the EU's position on its own values, leading to a softer European posture on Chinese human rights abuses. We saw something quite interesting, though, when Theresa May went to Beijing, and everyone thought, okay, they global Europe, global Britain, I should say, she's going to sign that agreement once she got to Beijing. And I was really surprised that she didn't. But there were key issues in there. For example, sustainability, transparency, and what's in it for the UK. So Beijing really thought that she would sign on the dotted line, but Theresa May did not. So, and also in the May 15th Belt and Road Jamboree that they had in Beijing, others have called it BARF, Belt and Road Forum. They have some unfortunate acronyms sometimes. The EU didn't sign. And, everyone expected Hungary or Greece to, go off and sign separately. But Jyrki Katainen, the vice president of the Commission, maintained discipline, and no member state signed. So this was a huge disappointment for China, and rather a shock. So you had 28 member states not signed, so that kind of put a damper on their party. And when you divide and rule, say, I'll invest here, all the member states want to give China the best deal. So China likes when they compete against each other. And then looking ahead, I mentioned to you the elements for an EU strategy on connecting Europe and Asia. That's going to be coming out in June or July, depending on how long you can put that name in to your browser, and you'll come up with it. So you can give your ideas. So this conference and all these people who are interested in this topic, you have a lot to contribute, and I think it's important that you do. And then the ASEM meeting will be held in Brussels this October. So Brussels is bracing for all these VIPs coming. It will be a huge, and maybe I'll see you there. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Okay.
Okay, so while we're waiting for the for the PowerPoint file, I just say that and the switch is. Okay. Yeah. So I said at the start of the seminar, the growth of Asia is the biggest event in modern economic history. So this is a huge change in the world economy. It creates structural adjustment problems in some countries. Car industry is declining, frictions somewhere, attitudes across the Atlantic that we are holding our breath to see what will be the impact of. So ASEM is a very important contribution to have this constructive cooperation, win-win cooperation between Europe and Asia, and I think that's the attitude in Europe. And in Italy, they struggle with employment. Norway is on the lucky side because we were exporting raw materials for which we had a tremendous price increase to a large extent because of growing world demand and generated by China and Asia. So we phased out our textiles early, and we exported oil and fish and things at good prices and got cheap goods in advance. So we had a huge terms of trade gain in Norway. So I will not speak on the general issues of Asia. I will speak here on the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a great initiative because there are many national transport plans and too few international transport plans. So transport policies are extremely costly, and they are often framed within the national context. You have, of course, transnational plans in the EU, etc., and you have international cooperation. But I think, so the bold initiative of BRI is a good thing. Of course, it's not void of national interest, because there is national interest in transportation politics, and so it's no surprise that China will have a national interest in infrastructure construction as well. So I'll try to shed light on this with a kind of bird's eye view. I'm glad that the other speakers spoke more about the concrete content of BRI and policy. So my perspective will be on the economic geography side. So I'll speak about agglomeration and gravity. What is the kind of force is pulling here? The impact of transport policy is very complex because you have kind of millions of shipments going in either direction. You have two places, you build a road. What will be the balance of the impact? So these are some themes. I think I'll skip this plan and go straight forward to the next thing. And to the right here, you have this very simple picture. It's a kind of bird's eye view on the Europe, Asia, and Belt and Road. So the big economic mass here is in Western Europe and in Asia. They are the big fellows, two of the three. The third is not here. It's the Americas, North America. And in the middle, you have those between. And they are not so big in the world economy. They are important, of course, but they are much smaller than Asia and much smaller than Western Europe. And here you find the Middle East, of course, commodity reliant. And then you find the Saudi Arabia of the North, Russia and many of former CIS, also very commodity reliant. And you have Central Asia and you have South Asia. So they are on the road, so to speak. So when you build the roads and links in this area, what will be the impact? Who will gain from it? So we try to shed light on this using a world economy model that we developed in a project we had on Russia a year ago, a couple of years ago. And the aim is to do more work, and this is just at the start, so I have to speak about results that are not yet published, but I'll tell you a couple of things from my computer. So first, a bit of generalities here. So when you are lowering trade costs by cutting tariffs or whatever, or building more efficient infrastructure, you get more trade. So then you get kind of standard economic effects. For example, if you are selling labor-intensive goods, you will suddenly sell more labor-intensive goods because of the better roads or the better infrastructure. So these are kind of standard effects with the geographical footprint because of the better infrastructure and the proximity. So then you have the impact due to economic geography, and that's a kind of new thing of economic theory since the 1980s, that when you have the mixture of economies of scale and location effects, so that some countries or regions are kind of better placed, they have lower costs than the others, etc., then you will have location effects, so you can have agglomeration in some places. Some trade costs, they are not affected by distance. You can think of a most favored nation tariff. You have 10% for all countries in the world. There is no geographical aspect. Then you have the spatial trade costs that depend on distance. So that is, if you ship the fish throughout from Norway to Europe, it's almost linear in distance. They use fuel and stuff. It's a bit less linear for shipping, and it's somewhere between for air transport. But so it's a geographical trade barrier. So these two, they interact. So when you have the tariffs and the roads, the tariff changes will have a geographical nature too. So the same reform or enlargement of the EU will have a different impact in different regions of the EU. So policies have a kind of geographical footprint. For example, this work reference here, some work I did on the eastward enlargement of the EU, saying that it would have an east-west impact, so that in a way the east of Germany would be better off than the west of Germany because of the kind of force of gravity from moving the economic mass towards the east. So this is the kind of forces we are speaking about. So another important distinction here is that that you have a standard effect in these new theories is that when you have economies of scale in production, then if you have a better location, you have an advantage in the production of these scale-based goods or services. So for example, large countries tend to be exporters of scale-based goods because they have a bigger domestic market. Centrally located countries in Europe would be better located than the peripheral ones, etc. So you can say that geography creates a comparative advantage. Or, so one way this shows up is that you get specialization. So the better located, those with the bigger, better market access would be net exporters of the scale-based stuff and import something else. This is one type of, so you have large trade effects. Another possibility, for example, if you have two similar countries, let's say Belgium and the Netherlands, they are all similar. So they won't specialize in cars versus fish. They will exchange cars, both like France and Germany would be better. So they will sell cars in both directions. So then you don't get this kind of specialization in different sectors, but you can have, in this setting, you would have income effects. So those with a better location would have higher income level and higher wages. So and these two effects are qualitatively a bit different. And there is a bit more empirical support for the income gradient of location than for the specialization story. And the spatial impact of the two may differ. So one thing is, for example, in some earlier work, I made some kind of technical papers here saying that, for example, when you have these trade effects, a big neighbor is a dangerous thing because it will push you out of this scale-based sector. But the wage-based scenario is a good thing because a big neighbor will pull you up with it. So there is a kind of positive gravity impact, and the competitive restructuring effect is lesser. So, so these are just some kind of background themes of economic geography. So I will start approaching the BRI. So one theme here, which is also kind of implicit in the analysis, is that international integration has an impact for domestic regions. This is especially important for Russia, huge countries, several regions. India and China with kind of 30 times France, each of them. So this matters. And, if you simulate models, you find that autarky creates centralization because there is no outside, of course. So you simulate autarky in China, the capital would be about Xi'an, which was the case, actually, at some stage in history. And for India, you find that globalization is good for northeast India. So connectivity kind of promotes the peripheries. And for Norway, the opening the border to Russia would be good for Finnmark, the absolute periphery of Norway. Yes, so this is relevant for China, India, and Russia, of course. Another theme which is relevant for the analysis is that along this route, especially the land-based route, there are plenty of commodity exporters. So I took these BRI kind of members, or those listed as BRI participant countries, about a bit more than 70. There were data for 60-something. And then you see that these on the right here, they have more than 10% natural resource rents as a percentage of their GDP. So you could say they are commodity reliant. This is, of course, important because some of these are very close to the route. So you have all the Russian regions with a very high reliance on commodities, but you also in Central Asia, you have this strong reliance on commodity exports. So therefore, you need analytical tools that don't forget this completely. So some trade and geography model have no commodities. So that's why we made a model at NUPI which has commodities. It's of course good for Norway too, because we are in this bunch of resource-dependent countries, even if you are on the rich end. So when you have this resource thing, you have, for example, you have these terms of trade effects that I mentioned. We have expensive oil and cheap T-shirts. So the terms of trade impact was a kind of huge gift to Norway over the last decades. So the terms of trade effects become very important. And secondly, you can have complete specialization. So you don't move between the manufacturing sectors anymore because you are making oil and gas in several, for example, 6 of the Russian regions, according to this. In this world trade model, you have 110 countries and regions, and Russia is split into 12. So the big countries are split up because of to gauge this regional impact. So, so then 6 regions in Russia are fully specialized. So roads or trade policies or tariffs, whatever, will not change their specialization as long as they are in. It's only the kind of price effects that matter for the impact. Yeah, so I made this numerical model. It sheds light on another aspect which is relevant for the Belt and Road, is the role of economic density. So this, I'm sorry, this has a Norwegian text. I didn't have the raw file yesterday. So this shows the the impact for Russia of a comparable cut in trade costs with respect to the CIS, the EU, and China. And you see that it's approximately similar and much larger for the 2 big fellows than for CIS. So low economic density kind of reduces the impact of local integration. And this matters if you go back to this. Does it work? Yes? Oh, it was many. Okay, go back to this hump. So should Russia choose between Asia or China and Europe? No, it should have both. And it should not, then they should have higher priority than the Eurasian Union, in a sense. So that's what, of course, this has to be qualified by what is feasible and so on. Maybe Eurasian is easier. But in principle, Russia should not choose one or the other. Ukraine should not at the juncture. They should have both. And this is an impact. So if Belt and Road is creating a radial structure of infrastructure from Beijing, it's just part of the solution for these intermediate countries. You should have the roads to Europe too. Okay, so let's see how long time it takes to get back on track. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So there are. So there is an interest here. I mean, so this kind of applies to these in-between countries. Here is my last slide. No, second last. So this is from the computer. This is a very crude illustration. Put no numbers because it's preliminary and has to be double-checked, whatever. So this says about the real income change from cutting the cost of distance by half for the countries in this graph. And you see it's those between and China. So cutting the cost towards China. And so you see that except for Singapore, which is losing from this, for some reason, I don't know exactly yet, I have to check the result, there is a gain for all of them. And you see that the gain is large for some of the Central Asian countries, and it's large for South Asia. So this is the first kind of crude attempt to capture some of these possible effects of constructing infrastructure and better connectivity in this area. So this is, as I said, simplified and crude. So the roads and infrastructure is just a scaling of distance. So this is, of course, very crude. We have great circles of distance, but this should, of course, be modeled in a better way based on data. But to do that, of course, we could spend 100 years because it's very difficult to measure all the transport costs between this 110 countries and regions in the model. So we could have to, we would need a multi-million project from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, bigger than the BRI, to get to the final truth on this. So in a sense, it's very necessary to be crude, in a sense. You have to make some stylized approximations. So, but this was, which I showed you, was a kind of starting point. We should take into account transport routes. For example, I did that in this paper on China, that the goods have to pass a specific way, maybe change, and then we could take into account transport modes, that the geographical impact of road transportation is much bigger than, for example, sea transportation. So of course, if you smoothen the railway line to Vladivostok, it's still a long way to go. But to capture transport modes, we want to work on this. So that's the plan. We now try to get funding to do this with partners in China, Institute of World Economics and Politics, CAS, and IDE JETRO in Japan, that has worked a lot with geography, has a lot of data on infrastructure in Asia. It will be interdisciplinary. Hans-Jürgen will take the lead on the political science aspect, the politics involved in the BRI. And I will work with this modeling jointly with the partners that have other models, so we kind of compare notes and use different tools to shed light on these kind of macro effects of BRI. So I hope to have more to say next time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I thank you, Arne, for this preliminary insight into your computers, and to Yun-Sun and Fallon for excellent presentations. Now I suggest that we take a short break with coffee, and then after the coffee break, that will be for around 15 minutes, we'll bring in some fresh air here, and then we'll rearrange, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll also open for the audience to engage in that discussion. Thank you so much.
it in, so I was trying to pay attention.
All right, are we ready to rumble? All right. I'm very happy to be here. It's a very good opportunity to have these types of events at NUPI because it encourages us to invite in great people. Some of them who are old friends of NUPI and some of them we are getting friendlier with. For this session, we thought we would engage more in a conversation between the four of us. And then also open up for questions from you guys. We will try to lift the conversation a little bit to not only focus on so much on China and the Belt and Road, but as China and the Belt and Road is kind of the locomotive when it comes to connectivity and infrastructure, of course, in Asia and between Asia and China and Europe, we will of course return to that as well. I've been asked to remind you guys that we are still being streamed, so for you guys who want to get up and ask questions, you will be known to the world, so you know that. But first off, we'll start a little bit among ourselves, and then we'll open up for more questions from the public. I was wondering, listening into your very interesting presentations, that we know that if we talk about the ASEM region, 51 countries, right, reaching with Australia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, all the way towards Europe, a lot of European countries. How connected are these countries or these regions if we compare them to other parts of the world? We only have 2 mics, so we have to switch them between ourselves. And I don't know, Yun, you're sitting next to me, so you're very happy to welcome to start.
First reaction. Compared to other parts of the region, I think it depends on which parts that you compare it to. Like if you compare it to Africa or Latin America, I would say that it is better. But if you compare it to North America, then I would say it's not as connected. But
in America, you mean that?
North America, yeah. And if you look at the whole Asia, the Eurasia region, there are different sub-regions as well. So West Europe, of course, is much better connected than the rest of the region.
Okay. There's some strange anomalies in this region as well. For example, India, it's 25% cheaper for India to trade with Brazil than with their neighbor Pakistan. So these are internal dynamics, but that's a remarkable difference. So there are some strange anomalies, but I would say I'm just looking, I had some notes on this. South Asia is the least integrated, only 5% of South Asia's total trade, compared to 25% in ASEAN. So that's probably the weakest link in the whole area, and that's actually where China's putting a lot of investment. So ASEAN's been working on this, and there's this idea that connectivity, especially in Brussels, when people talk about connectivity, they think it's owned by China, that phrase, but ASEAN gets annoyed because ASEAN was talking about connectivity decades ago, and even Europe has had programs to kind of promote connection as well. So China's been very, very good at marketing this.
So I think that infrastructure is very costly. So it's billions and billions, and it's paid partly by governments and partly by by business. So and I think both parts are very income related. So poor countries have bad budgets. So for example, India has a much much smaller public budget tax revenue than China, for example. So therefore, India has a problem with domestic infrastructure. And this is kind of quite generic. So poor countries are not so well connected. And the second is that business pays for it too, and then and transport costs are often kind of endogenous. So of course you build a huge harbor, and there is no ship. It will of course be a bad investment, and it will be not worth the investment. So, and you see that, for example, shipping routes, they are developing by trade, and you build ports where the ships come, in a sense. So it's not the other way around, that you first build the port and then the traders come. So yeah, and this applies to the BRI, for example. Let's say take the northern route. We didn't speak so much about it, but that depends on business activity in Russia. Because if all the activity along the Arctic coast by Russia, which is necessary to maintain the infrastructure for this northern route, if this is to be paid by Putin and his public budget, it will be very costly. So there has to be activity. In the 50s, the communists made activity there, so there were more settlements, so they could kind of afford to pay for it. So yeah, so that's an issue. So yes.
All right, so let's continue on that note a little bit. We talked quite a bit in your presentations about China. Now we heard a little bit about India. We heard Russia mentioned. Besides these, or amongst these big countries, and besides these countries, who are kind of the big initiators or the countries and states that seem to be most excited about creating more connectivity and infrastructure types of opportunities, both among the Asian countries themselves and also in the connections towards Europe? Is there other countries besides China that is pushing forward?
I think China is the one that's taking the lead. If you look among the 5 BRICS countries, Russia is enthusiastic because Russia is under sanctions. So China is pretty much the largest source that Russia can still get financing from. India has made it clear that they are against Belt and Road Initiative, and especially after the Doklam standoff last year. I was in India in January, and the sentiment is still very very hurtful. But I think there's this question, there's this myth that China says that, okay, so if you look at the global or the regional infrastructure market, there's this huge gap of funding. It is true and it is not true. If you look at the international financial market, there's plenty of funding there. But the funders don't want to fund or invest in these projects for a very good reason, because either they're not commercially viable or because the countries that these projects are located in are not politically stable. So investors refuse to go to certain countries not because they don't have the money, but because they don't have enough good projects on the ground. So China is saying that, okay, we have the money and we're willing to go there, we're willing to carry the risk. And of course, that's going to be welcomed by the countries who cannot get funding from the international financial market otherwise. But then whether that's a good decision for the investor, for China as a financier, is a big question.
Could you see, for instance, adding to that, in India, in Japan, that they're also putting forward substantial initiatives on their own in terms of their partnerships and their relations, or is China really standing apart as like the major driver?
I've compared several different development initiatives or financing initiatives that made by Japan and India in recent, say, 12 months. In terms of the scale, they are nowhere near to compare what China has put out on the table. But there's a difference of the model as well. India and Japan, they have central governments that are strong enough to put out some funding for it. But China, basically, the state financing or the financial resources is controlled by the state. So, and the state has $3.1 trillion in terms of its foreign reserves. So the government can make the determination as for where the money will go and what kind of projects it will fund. And that is well, I guess that is an advantage if you look at it from a state competition point of view, that no other countries or Western countries or democracies will be able to do that.
Okay. There's also a big issue of what we call promise fatigue. I mean, China pledges all this money. It's incredible, like 45 billion, 50 billion. I mean, these numbers are huge. But then when people actually look at what's been delivered, it's much more, it's a much smaller chunk. And that's across the board. In all these countries that they've pledged huge amounts of money, I think Indonesia, only 17% of it's actually shown up. So they grab the headlines and everyone's like, oh my gosh, it gives a perception that China has deep pockets and you'll get these projects. And it's doing a great job because that's pretty much what we're talking about all the time now is the Belt and Road. But there is, initially, I just want to pick up on your comment about India. India was the second biggest investor in the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So they were actually positive at the beginning, and then for geopolitical reasons, with Doklam, with what's happening in Sri Lanka, I think that they've turned a bit sour, and they wouldn't even attend the meeting in May in Beijing. So there are geopolitical implications as well that other countries, we're seeing a response. I mean, it's been this has been going on since 1996. With the demise of the Soviet Union, China has been looking at their neighborhood, and they've been going there. Now, with Xi Jinping, he just put a label on it. But this has been going on for quite a long period of time. And so when we say, is it successful, is it not successful, you can't measure it because old projects that are successful are folded into the narrative. So it's very elastic, and there's no way to measure it. And now that it's been absorbed into the Constitution, which shocked everybody, it's not going to go away. So this is really a significant policy of Xi Jinping, and it will not go away, even though, as we saw, there are many red elephants dotted along the way. And then we've seen the quadrilateral, maybe we were at the same event, in India at the Raisina Dialogue. And the quadrilateral are the 4 countries. It's kind of a response to China. So you have Japan, Australia, India, and the US kind of responding to China's investments and growing military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So Australia has also talked about expanding this to use not just military, but economic. So these 4 countries are getting together to talk about economic issues and development in the region. So it's very hard to match China's promises and deep pockets, but as Mohan Malik published recently an article that when this happens, small countries always win because they can get money from them and they get money from them. So this is kind of the classic, and the best winners in this situation of competition for influence are the smaller countries. And then I'll just, one last comment, infrastructure hardly ever pays, never does. Look at the Eurotunnel. They barely, break even. So even in modern westernized countries, these major infrastructure projects usually are, money losing.
Yes, so I'm not the political expert on the political responses, but from a general observation, my impression is that the awareness of importance of infrastructure is global. So in South America, when they discuss regional integration, it's not tariffs that is paramount. I mean, they discuss infrastructure as part of the kind of South American regional project, for example. And in Africa, research shows very clearly about the problems of landlocked countries and the problems of missing infrastructure. So there is, of course, costly there too. In Asia, I think when some earlier initiatives, my impression was that Korea and Japan had a very strong awareness. It's growing in India. So in India, it's rising in the political hierarchy in their agendas. And of course, the development banks are all engaged. So yeah, so I think it's on the rise. So now we need to know how much to pay.
All right. But looking at this from a bit of a historical perspective, not going too far back in history, but Asia has the big populations, the big markets, the big economies, very interconnected value change. When it comes to connectivity and infrastructure, also looking towards Europe, is this like a big moment in time, or is this more of a continuation of something that has happened gradually for many, many years already? Is something really big happening now in terms of connectivity, or is it kind of a hype that is called Belt and Road in terms of China?
Like Teresa said, this is a continuation of the Chinese model of overseas investment. First of all, in its periphery, in its neighborhood, then extending to other parts of the world, especially in Africa. So China started this going out strategy. These Chinese companies are promoted to go out with Chinese funding in 2001, and before that, Jiang Zemin started the 2 markets. So Chinese companies are supposed to use domestic markets and foreign markets, domestic resources and foreign resources back in 1994. So I would say there is a track record of it. But like Teresa pointed out, a lot of the previous projects are now folded into the Belt and Road narrative. And Xi Jinping has made a determined call to make this his foreign policy signature projects. So we're seeing that most of the Chinese efforts are being described or labeled as a Belt and Road.
And there's probably a reason why these projects didn't happen in the past. I mean, they're very small populations, as you showed on your wonderful slides, and there's not a lot of reason to make money there, but it's kind of a hub and spoke. All roads kind of lead back to Beijing. So it has geopolitical implications as well as economic, but the key question is, these railways that are just passing through, will they, all right, China has, even if it has all this excess capacity, and even if they build all these railways, it's just a drop in the bucket for their excess capacity. So these are just not making a lot of sense to economists, and maybe you can shed some light on that.
Well, I think the question is if there could be a rust belt. So then, of course, I think the kind of the forces of the economy will kind of ultimately decide what will be successful. So then I think South Asia is on the rise. So South Asia and India is a safe bet. So roads leading to India and South Asia will pay off in the long run. So it's a bit more tricky in Central Asia because it's smaller, low economic density, etc. And of course, there is a long way from Europe to Asia anyway. So yeah, so this is kind of speculative, but I think ultimately the economic success will determine what pays off.
You may.
May I? Thank you. Thank you. So just add to that. So I agree with Teresa. So in a lot of these cases, look at Central Asia or look at country like Laos, or that they don't have much of an industrial base to begin with. So you build railways through the country, and what kind of trade are you really facilitating with the local economy? Because they don't have anything, they don't have much to trade other than the natural resources. But the counter argument to that is that with the road, they may not have enough to trade, but without the road, they don't even have somewhere to begin with. So to build a road and to build the infrastructure, the Chinese will argue that, well, at least we put the infrastructure there on the ground for them to start working on something. That yes, maybe their human resources, their labor still needs the training for them to start factories. And it will take a lot of time to attract the foreign investment to really set up factories in the middle of Laos or in the middle of Kyrgyzstan. But at least it provides them with some opportunity to begin with. They may not use or make full use of those opportunities, but that is the local government or the recipient government decision to make. It's not, the Chinese will claim that it's not their decisions to make. They will try to facilitate trade and try to facilitate the growth of the industrial base. But eventually, it's the recipient government's responsibility to adopt those policies. But then that's another tricky issue.
Can I just a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure. Lots of tricky issues.
So, yeah, those are really good points. And I am going to go back just momentarily in economic history, because if you think about how the railways were built in the United States, British bankers lost their shirt on that. They went bankrupt, but the Americans got all these great railways. So the same thing could be repeated in Central Asia. So they might just nationalize the railways. I don't know. I mean, but this is a dangerous ploy as well for China. It's very high risk. And now China has announced they have they're coming up with their own courts to deal with Belt and Road regulations and issues. So this is kind of a new thing as well, and it's very unclear at this point how that's going to play out. Will that have to do with the WTO? Will it be separate from the WTO? China calls the rules. So, things are happening that even, that was just announced not that long ago. So things are happening all the time, and it's evolving. So a lot remains to be seen.
All right, asking a short question, kind of the same that I asked already. If we consider the dimension of things, whether it's a continuation or it's a big boost right now, do you think amongst us scholars, if we had been sitting 5 years ago, looking 5 years into the future, would we have reason back then to be very surprised by what is happening now? Or is it kind of what we had been supposedly foreseeing all the time?
5 years ago, I think that will be around the same time that Xi Jinping first ascended to power during the National People's Congress session in 2000.
Yeah.
Exactly 5 years. The National People's Congress, the Chinese Parliament, is having their session this week, and some shocking announcements are supposed to happen. So I think 5 years ago, people were still living in the inertia of the Chinese foreign policy from the previous leader, Hu Jintao. So we know that since Deng Xiaoping, China has this foreign policy mantra called biding our time and building our strengths. So for almost 3 decades, China maintained a very relatively low profile foreign policy. That now to show China's strengths and now to claim to be the regional leader, that has now been changed under Xi Jinping. But 5 years ago, I don't think people were expecting such a dramatic change in Chinese foreign policy. So that happened really during the past 5 years. And people were suspicious as to how sustainable this foreign policy momentum will be, given that the tacit understanding for Chinese politics is that a leader will stay for only 2 terms. But now Chinese government is trying to change the constitution to remove that term limits. So that's Xi Jinping's message to the world that I'm here to stay and the Belt and Road is here to stay. For anyone who has been hoping for this to be changed, you can stop hoping.
I'm glad you brought that up. I tried to gauge people's impressions in Brussels when it was announced last Sunday, a week ago, many analysts were expecting this because Xi Jinping, no leader has garnered so much power. They call him the emperor of everything. He has so much power and control. And they were just wondering, he might never go away, or will he go in the background like Deng Xiaoping and then, pull the strings and have someone younger than him run the show. But we could see with the recent meeting that he didn't choose anyone who could possibly challenge him so that he would be around. And now this announcement really kind of removes the fig leaf of help us reform, because even in China, it was so, the Chinese people themselves were so upset by this decision that, the screens were going black, people's phones are like, I've got a black screen, and you couldn't, the letter N was deleted, and so it kind of spells Xi Jinping without an N, and that's kind of humorous. Winnie the Pooh, all these things that were, so it really makes the West kind of look at China with a great deal of concern. I don't know if this is confidence, that they have so much confidence now and they see even, for example, the Vatican is trying to cut a deal with the Chinese Communist Party. So maybe they just have this, very strong sense of everyone is kind of changing their values to a certain extent. We saw, for example, Cambridge University Press agreed to self-censor their documents in their journal in order to make it into the huge Chinese market. And all these academics around the world complained, so they had to reverse that decision. But we've seen Springer, another German publication, they do the same thing. Many countries and companies, we can think of another example in Europe, who will meet with the Dalai Lama. There, I said it, oh my gosh, I might have a problem now. So, so it's instead of China, the West kind of embracing China and having them join the WTO and hoping this will, make them join the liberal international order, it just kind of strengthened them, and our values are changing or eroding, or maybe they were never there, I'm not sure. But it just seems that there's been an unanticipated consequence of these actions that were taken in the past when China, this maybe it was a false perception that if we do all these things for China. And in Brussels, for example, they had the New Year gala, and they had it in the Beaux-Arts Theater, and they had, fantastic singers and dancers. And then at one point, and my son was with me, and he just looked at me, he's like, oh, mommy, this is a propaganda part. And then the lady came out, and she was singing, and they had the flag, and they had like 5 big pictures flash on the screen. And one of them, so they had their aircraft carrier, they had a nuclear test, and the audience is in Brussels kind of like, it was a bit tone deaf, I think. And but one of the interesting things was they flashed on the screen accession to the WTO. So out of the 5 photos of their, their narrative, one of them was, the Chinese understand that was key to their growth. And now you see this kind of, Monday morning quarterback, like, oh my gosh, what have we done? So they've just grown in power, and this was really an unanticipated consequence. But it was maybe Chinese strategists or people who look at China, China watchers had it wrong. And now there's kind of a mea culpa. So there you go.
Yes. So so about the 5-year question, I don't have a clear answer, but obviously BRI is a kind of product of China's growth and power. But I perceive it as a very constructive international initiative because, as I said at the introduction, there are too many. There are kind of comparatively many national transport plans, and few international transport plans because they are squeezed by budgetary concerns, and it's difficult coordination issues. For example, when we discuss the High North route, how is the cost and income will be divided between Norway, Russia, and the users? It's quite difficult. So I think it's for the West, it could be good to kind of see that this is a constructive initiative, promoting global transport policies, lifting that to another level, and we could use this as a kind of moment to kind of strengthen the global thinking about transport politics. By the way, a footnote is that this thing about too many national plans and too few international, it doesn't hold everywhere. So when you go to India, they say to get stuff to Japan is a piece of cake, but getting it through India is not. So in a sense, there is also a need for national plans. But I think the international coordination is a good thing. Yes.
Great. I'm going to open up for a few questions very soon, but just one question before. Arne brought us back to the greater Asia region and interconnections. There has been in recent years quite a few initiatives when it comes to trade alliances or trade pact or free trade agreements. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is not dead, is still being discussed, although people seem to assume it's over since the US is out. There is a region, not alternative, but supplement through the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that's the ASEAN. They have their regional initiatives with China, with Japan, with India, with Australia. Do you guys have any knowledge of where those processes are in terms of being realized more or less soon, or whether we will see continuations of those being stalled and stalled and stalled? I keep looking at all three of you to take the initiative, but it's okay that we do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can, do you want me to go? Okay. Yeah, that's a good question about TPP. As we know, on day 3 of Trump's administration, after 7 painful years of negotiation to get everyone on board on TPP and a lot of political capital spent, he's like, it's over, it's finished. So that was a disaster, I think. Now there's TPP 11, and it's still going, and I was in Japan in October, and they're like, we're keeping a chair warm, for the next president. Maybe he'll be interested. Now Trump is flip-flopping perhaps, and he said that maybe he'll go back in, but they're like, we're moving ahead, and we're tired of this. And so I think they've lost a lot of political capital on that one. An unanticipated consequence of all this is Europe, because the US, I always wondered, why did they choose to do TPP first? Before the Trans-Pacific Partnership, before TTIP, the European angle with the US. And my thinking was that they were thinking, if we can sew up TPP, the Europeans will have to agree with us on TTIP. And I think that was the US strategy. Well, when TPP fell apart, TTIP is in the freezer. And the Europeans have had an FTA with Japan, which was so eager to get an FTA through. And they've also had, the Europeans have an FTA with South Korea. So the Europeans are actually creating the framework now, and the US will have to follow their rules, because this is very important trade agreements, and the US is just lagging behind. So the Europeans are creating these norms, and the US will have to get on board with the European created norms in that sense. So the US had it, they thought they were kind of leading the Europeans, TPP first, then TTIP, but it didn't work out that way at all. Okay, that's my comment about trade. Sorry, there you go.
Well, I think on TPP, I was told that they call themselves Ocean's 11. So, but but it's progressing and moving ahead. So there's a specific plan of the rest to proceed with TPP, and on TTIP, I mean Malmström, the commissioner of the EU, has clearly said that there should be a change of attitude across the Atlantic to pick up, because the situation has been changed. So in the new trade policy plan of Trump, he has said there will be a model agreement for Africa, which one is unknown, and UK is extensively mentioned in the document, but it's and they will make trade agreements, but which ones is not so clear. Yeah, so that will halt, but the rest of the world will continue. And of course, in Asia, there has been a tremendous growth in regional integration. So since the turn of the century, the coverage of FTAs within Asia has kind of gone from a very low level with ASEAN at the time to a very high coverage. So there's been an explosion in trade integration, which is kind of accompanying the infrastructure plans.
I'm going to let you comment, but Arne, shortly before, and Teresa also, if you have additions, how well rigged is Europe in terms of following this? You're saying now, Teresa, that the EU, European countries are towards some countries actually now stepping in and taking the lead in terms of developing the new agreements. But how well are we equipped to actually tap into the continuing and future growth of these Asian economies?
Yes, I think Europe in the EU has quite a proactive trade agenda. So that you have several negotiations ongoing. The small EFTA actually also has. So there are many processes going on in terms of trade agreements. So this track is being pursued. The problem, you could say that the paradox of trade policy is that there is a need for integration across continents, and there are potentially huge economic benefits from, for example, Europe-Asia integration. But Asia cannot harmonize all their laws to European standards for chemicals and food. So it's difficult to solve all these non-tariff issues in trade policy. So that kind of tends to limit the depth of agreement that you can make. But yes, it's proceeding. So there is progress and more to come.
Well, India has been kind of on the back shelf for the Europeans, but now they're really working hard to engage India. So I think that's the next one that they really want to deal with, and it's difficult. There are a lot of challenges, but I think it's a high priority for them. And just one other anecdote. I mean, once the free trade agreement was signed with South Korea and it kicked in, things changed so dramatically in Brussels. You know, they had a Korean cultural center, and the Korean they had such a presence. So it just kind of rejuvenated this type of relationship, or even strengthened it. Now Japan, it was just concluded at the end of 2017, so I'm wondering if that will happen as well, and if this Japanese public diplomacy will improve relations between Europe and Japan, because Japan obviously is looking for their issues to be on the European agenda.
Coming back to US and China on the issue of FTA, so on TPP, I think in late January, early February, Trump administration flirted with this idea that U.S. might consider joining TPP again. But I was in Tokyo last month, and the Japanese reaction is, no, we do not want any further negotiation on this. So thank you, but no. But then the question, I think, looking from the Chinese perspective, they saw TPP as a primary instrument or a pillar of Obama administration's rebalancing New Asia strategy. And they see that TPP as intrinsically an American orchestrated trade agreement to isolate China, to exclude China from this Trans-Pacific region, this free trade region. So the Chinese version, which is not at first proposed by China, was RCEP. So there was this debate as for RCEP and TPP. They're in competitive relations. Which one is going to be more prominent? But now with the Americans' diminished interest in TPP, we don't see as much interest coming out of China on RCEP either. There's less momentum. I would say that it's still there, but there's less momentum from Beijing to push for that. And this leads to this interesting observation that it seems to me that for U.S. and China, this great powers propensity seems to negotiate free trade agreement bilaterally rather than across the region. At least that's true for the Trump administration. And if you look at China, China has FTA with ASEAN as a whole. China has free trade agreement with South Korea. But this free trade agreement, for example, in the case of South Korea, has not prevented China from adopting other trade measures to prohibit or to affect trade, to diminish trade when they see the political need to do so. And there are tacit, say, unofficial sanctions on South Korea there are additional inspection measures for South Korean export to China because of the THAAD deployment in South Korea that China perceived to be a threat to China's national security. So there was these non-trade measures that China adopted that are basically against the spirit of free trade agreement, but China adopted them anyway.
Just one final comment. It's interesting about RCEP because I talked to some negotiators in Brussels, and I mean TPP was supposed to be a high level to to kind of protect workers in Europe and the U.S. have a high level trade agreement, but RCEP is so low level, according to some trade negotiators, that once TPP just faded away, that there was no need, not even a drive to try to negotiate a very low level agreement, which would be pretty much meaningless and just time consuming.
All right, we'll return to these issues, and now we'll open up for a few questions. You need to speak in a mic so that our loudspeakers can pick you up and deliver you to our world audiences. So Christopher first, maybe, and then Ulf, and then, yeah. And if I'll stop you guys, there will be more time before we leave to ask more questions.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for a very, very interesting talk about these topics. My name is Christopher Ronneberg. I'm a journalist with the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. I'd just like to touch upon two things that you've already started talking about, but I hope you might be able to say more. One is this notion of the West now changing its perception of China's rise and its growing influence. We all know that creditors have political power. I mean, we've seen how the World Bank has been able to change countries and the way they operate internally. And now we see the same thing happening with China and the way they are using their political clout. You mentioned Greece, how they stopped that human rights report. We've seen the Dalai Lama issue. We see countries for so long having believed that you can change China from within if you just talk to it nicely. We've seen Norway for the past 8 years be completely still, not uttering a critical word of any kind towards China. Do you think that there's growing recognition amongst academics, analysts, about China's true power, that they aren't going to change into sort of a Western version of itself? Do you think that's going to lead to more of a political change? I mean, we've already seen Germany, to some extent, being critical of China in ways that they haven't for the past few years. So that was my first thing. The second one is more simple. You talked about how European countries could look at Brussels and point to them for saying no to trade deals from China. Norway is outside of the EU, facing similar pressures. To what extent is Norway more vulnerable than EU members when it comes to these types of questions? Thank you.
You seem to look at Teresa when you post your questions. You're right. You're right.
It's red because the red is.
Everyone else is, of course, welcome to comment, but Teresa, start. Yeah.
Those are very good questions. There's a great book. It's called "To Change China" by Jonathan Spence, and he looks at the history of. It's not just this generation, but in the past generations, everyone thought they could change China, and it's a brilliant book. But if you look at this month's Foreign Affairs, Campbell and Eli Ratner wrote an article that made everyone go crazy, that, maybe we were wrong and we should be humble and not be so naive. And, they were looking at China the way they wanted to see it rather than what it really was. And I would say that the Chinese are very, I have complete respect for their strategic instincts. And I lived in Beijing from 2003 to 2007 when my children were very young. And I would see their books. And Chinese, it's in their fairy tales. The strategic instinct is right there from the very start. I mean, the three kingdoms, like how do you play these countries off each other or these three kingdoms off each other? So they're really brilliant strategists, I would say. And it's inborn, it's innate. They don't even know that how great strategy they have. There's also a whole narrative, which is, I find troubling, and I'm writing about it right now. For example, the European Parliament had commissioned a paper a couple of years ago, and these academics wrote, China has no strategy. That's a brilliant strategy to make everyone think you don't have a strategy. That's the most clever thing to do, I think, in the world. And now this is when you have a label, when you call it Belt and Road, then there's pushback. So maybe the Chinese might have been more wise to not say anything and to just continue making all these investments and doing all these things. But when you put a big, they must have had a cost-benefit analysis. When you put a big banner on it, then it calls attention to it. People examine it. Is it real? What does this mean? Are they more ambitious? What does that mean for our own security? So, and as any country in history, when you have a lot of investments overseas, you have kind of military ties. So we see the first overseas base now in Europe, well, in Africa, Djibouti. So it's getting, the Europeans tend to think, oh, Asia, it's so far away. We don't really have to worry about it, maybe 20, 30 years. But no, it's right in their neighborhood. And we see with the northern route, Chinese ships will be getting closer and closer to Europe. We've seen military exercises in the Black Sea 2.5 years ago. And then this past summer, right here in Europe. I mean, so, they were shooting missiles near Kaliningrad. So it's in the water. So it's, China's getting closer. And I think everyone's been a bit complacent and thinking when Chinese leaders say, help us reform, I mean, this is kind of what you hear in Brussels all the time. They're like, you reform and help us reform. This is like, and the Europeans like that kind of missionaries. They're like, yeah, we'll help you reform. And then they're all shocked, about what's happening now when China's dictating terms to them. I don't want to go on too long, sorry. There you go.
So I think that there is a kind of escalation between the United States and China currently in trade issues. So you had this advisor of President Trump, Navarro, who's written this book with the title "Death by China," etc., with a quite anti-China attitude. So in the USA, there is this confusion between trade agreements and trade, in a sense. So the trade deficit of the US with China has been multiplied because China has multiplied. So the ratio is the same, but the volume is larger. But the US trade deficit over time, it looks the same if you have it with China or without China. So it's caused by structural phenomena. But nevertheless, China is then attacked for cheating in terms of state-owned enterprises and steel and stuff. And this is escalating now because of you have, of course, the proposed steel and aluminium thing. You have the blockage of appellate body members in the WTO, which should block one of the three major pillars of WTO. So the European attitude has been that we should solve this within the family. Okay, they have been kind of agreeing with the Americans on some issues, for example, on steel. And of course, there are issues about state-owned enterprises, which is being discussed, and the European attitude is a cooperative one, and I think that's the one to pursue. But there are these adjustment problems, which follows from this huge increase in competition from Asia, so which is felt in many countries, but it has to be solved in a cooperative manner, and I think there could be kind of an important year for how this should be handled, because some of these conflicts about trade are escalating.
The American community, the policy community, would call now a post-engagement era for China policy. So before this current stage, that we believe that China, the assumption was that we can work with China, we can reform China, we can make China more like us. And when China becomes more like us, then it will be a responsible holder in the liberal democratic international order. And now China has given its very clear answer that no, we are not going on that route. So on the issue of ambiguity, whether China has a strategy, I think ambiguity is regarded as a virtue in Chinese culture, especially before you have the capacity to achieve your clarified goals. So before you can have that capacity, you do not tell people what your goals are, and that's a Chinese cultural element. So where we are now is that, do we regard China as a legitimate alternative to what we have? And we may not like it, but it's still there. Or we can deny its legitimacy, but China's influence in the world will keep expanding, especially among China's like-minded countries. And there are plenty of like-minded countries in the world that like China. And the Chinese culture, again, if you look at Xi Jinping's statements today, they emphasize, especially on political system and governance issue, they emphasize this term called 和而不同. that we can be cooperative, but we don't have to be the same. So we can have different political systems, but we can still cooperate with each other. And that idea is vastly popular among non-democratic countries in, say, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So we are pretty much forced to coexist with a China that we're not particularly comfortable with. But what kind of strategy we're going to develop to counter that, or to coexist with that, or try to undermine that? It's interesting that some of the Indian and Japanese scholars or strategic thinkers, they have a longer term view. And their speculation is that China is now, its economy and its political power is at its peak. So China is trying to expand. China is trying to do everything. China is trying to conquer the world in the Chinese way. So just let it, because this will be the beginning of China's imperial overstretch. And if you look at the commercial viability of their projects, look at how many problems that they have created locally and how much pushback they have created in countries in almost everywhere, then yes, although China's power might be at its peak and is very prominent and is spreading, but it's not sustainable. So that's some of the, I guess, alternative Asian perspective on that.
If I can just pick up a comment there, because I'm sorry, you did ask 2 points, and you said Norway alone, and people didn't get a chance to touch on that. And that it is terrifying, because let's face it, in Singapore a couple of years ago, a Chinese minister said to Singaporean official, we're a big country and you're a small country, and just kind of like get used to it. So that's kind of their narrative. It's not multilateralism, it's we're big, you're small, and you know, that's how it goes. And so we're seeing bandwagoning. You know, the people, especially with this Trump administration looking inward, what are these countries going to do? So it's an uncomfortable position to be in. So let's think about what kind of world we want to live in. And now we see not just censorship in China. You know, I don't know if you were reading the papers over the weekend. Google, Apple Cloud, you know, they handed over the key to the Chinese. So censorship is everywhere. And for example, this guy who was with Marriott Hotel, who liked something on Twitter, and he lost his job because he hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, because he liked something that was about Tibet. And we saw with Daimler-Benz, Mercedes, the ad for Instagram that had a quote from the Dalai Lama, and so that person got fired too. So the censorship is not just in China. It's not like it's an uncomfortable truth. We don't have to deal with them unless we go on holiday. No, it's happening. It's invading our lives right now. And we can't read certain things anymore. People can't publish certain things. It's happening. It's in play. So we really should think about this. I liked your point about ambiguity. I agree with you. The Europeans are always like, you must be more transparent, China. Tell us what you're doing. You know, really? That's kind of naive, I think. You know, they keep saying, we want you to be transparent. For example, I can just think of a fun anecdote. When they bought the aircraft carrier from Ukraine, there's a rule you can't take anything through with the Montreux Convention. So they told them, don't worry, it's going to be a casino. So that's how they got their aircraft carrier. And just one last anecdote. On his deathbed, Nixon reportedly said to his speechwriter, because Kissinger is all, you know, renowned for this, you know, brilliant strategy of shifting towards China and away from Russia, the Soviet Union. Well, Nixon on his deathbed said, I think we've created a Frankenstein.
Can I just add on to that?
Short.
Just about this issue on the Chinese influence. Well, I don't work for the Chinese government. I have been away from China for too long. I think the issue of the Chinese influence in other countries or the censorship in other countries, there is an element of offensiveness or defensiveness here. So if you look at what the Chinese try to censor, it's always something about China. It's either on Taiwan or it's Dalai Lama or the Chinese political system. So this, I think, the Chinese action, even in the United States, which is a very big issue these days, they're trying to foster a narrative in other countries that are less critical about China or more friendly toward what China is trying to do globally. But it's really about the domestic politics or the domestic economy in a foreign country. In other words, I call it a defensive propaganda. So it's to shape the public opinion in other countries in a China-friendly manner, but it's not an offensive narrative trying to change the political system in another country. I think that's a fundamental difference between what we have now and what we have probably with Soviet Union during the Cold War. In other words, China is not trying to export its political system to the United States or to European countries. If African government asks China for help on how to govern a country without democracy, China will help. But I won't say that China is actively trying to promote the Chinese political or economic system in other countries.
All right, moving on in the spirit of connectivity, let's connect with Ulf. He needs a mic.
Thank you so much. I have several questions, but I'll try to stick to 2 or 3. The first is that we are now around 7 billion people on the planet, and we'll probably rush to 10, 11 billion people. So we need a lot of investments, So in that sense, this is good. But we also have to make sure that these investments are made in a way that makes it possible to have a greener economy. So the first question is basically how and to what extent these Belt and Road initiatives can help to promote also green development. And maybe, so that's to Yun Sun perhaps. And then the second point picks up on what Christopher Rønneberg brought up. I think it's extremely difficult for a small country like Norway to pursue its own policy towards all Asian countries, but in particular to China, because of size, and it's very difficult. And I think that what we might see is that there might be transatlantic tensions between how Europe deals with Asian countries and how the US deals with Asian countries, and that could be demanding. But let me just bring up one specific topic, and that relates to the screening of Chinese investments that are currently being discussed in Europe. To my understanding, if the EU introduces legislation that are similar to the draft that was proposed in September 2017, that is now being discussed, I think this will be EEA relevant, as it is called. That it means that this legal act will have to enter into the EEA agreement. So although Norway is not member of the EU, and is not member of EU's trade policy either, external trade policy or commercial policy, the introduction of the screening, I see it as a barrier. It could be seen as a barrier to a free trade pattern within the internal market. So in order to ensure the integrity and homogeneity of the internal market, those those screening rules should be also introduced into Norway. That makes Norway into part of that European screening regime. So I'm just curious if you could say something more, Fan, on what's the status now of the screening regulation. You mentioned yourself the CFIUS, etc. And then a final point is about China investing abroad, and then both Yun Sun and Fallon has said that, okay, if you invest abroad, you need to follow up with some kind of military bases or things to protect your investments in Djibouti. Well, Norway is also a massive investor, probably owns around 1.2, 1.3% of all stocks listed in the world. But we don't have a big army to follow our investments. And I don't think any politician now either are planning to buy aircraft carriers or something, although we probably would afford it. But there's another way of protecting your investment, and that is to promote the support for some kind of strong international norms, governance regimes, have some kind of transparency, have international standards for investments. So how and to what extent do you see the China rise in investments abroad as challenging or promoting that development towards, let's say, guidelines for international investors? Thanks.
All right, so let's start with Yun and green. How green can it be?
How green can it be? Depends on the recipient country. That's the Chinese practice is that they will follow the lowest common denominator, the lowest possible rules in the recipient country. They're not going to go beyond that. So if the recipient country requires certain projects, for example, hydropower projects, to follow certain international standard, the Chinese will do it. But the Chinese argument is that, well, you have to understand with different standards, it comes with different prices. So the higher standard inevitably requires more funding or more stringent implementation. And if the recipient country or the recipient government does the economics and regards that as acceptable, they will do that. But that is just to say that China will not go beyond the lowest requirement in the recipient countries. And I think that's where countries like Norway could play a role. That in the first possibility, China does want to cooperate with Western countries in their investment in developing countries because it will diversify the risks. It will also give the Chinese projects a better image. And the second possibility is that the recipient countries actually wants to cooperate with Western countries because that will help them to enhance their standard and also to enhance their ability to bargain with China.
I'll jump in with one question added to that because it's part of the picture as I see it. So green, the other question is sustainability. To what extent do you see the conditions or the standards being promoted today also take into the fact that many of these projects are in very vulnerable, very conflict-ridden areas? Is the question of sustainability taken seriously?
A simplified answer is no, because the Chinese policymaking coming to their foreign investment is quite pragmatic. In the past 20 years, I would say, is to chase after natural resources to fuel in China's domestic economic growth. China needed more oil, China needed more copper. So they needed to buy these assets overseas and ship them back to China to fuel into the Chinese economy. And now it has shifted a little bit is to facilitate the absorption of the overcapacity in the Chinese market. So it is how to create contracts for Chinese dam builders or Chinese railway companies in other countries. And the Chinese companies have this perception that, yes, we get this funding from the Chinese government to build this project in this country. And once we complete it, we're going to go home. And what the recipient country will do with the project is not our business. So I don't think that's part of the plan.
All right. Teresa, screening.
Okay, that's a very good question. I hadn't thought about the Norway angle. I'm going to have to investigate that because I can't speak with authority on that, but that's a great question. Before I left, I did interview people about what the status was of this proposed. Well, originally they had projected it would take 2 years. Now it's been telescoped into 1 year. They're expecting it to get through in 1 year. Even the way things work at the EU level is that they just want to get something done, even if it's very weak and watered down, and then they can strengthen it. That's kind of the approach, like you just get it and then you can strengthen it later. So that's what they're working on right now. So it will be watered down, and I was a bit surprised with one person I interviewed. They said, so we're depending on the media to highlight these projects that aren't going to be caught in this screening net right now. And they're hoping that the media will, flag it and say, hey, just because it's under discussion now, maybe these will be kind of tried in the media, even though this isn't getting off the ground. And even CFIUS is not the solution in the US. It's undergoing reform right now. So there's a lot of holes in it. For example, the Chinese have studied how it's structured. They're not, when a project's turned down, they're not required to explain why, because they'll just say it's national security. So the Chinese study all the ones that have been turned down, and they realize if they invest under a certain level, a certain threshold of investment, it doesn't even make it to the radar. So the Chinese try to do smaller investments, and then they buy Silicon Valley companies, then they buy bigger and bigger ones. So, and they're not Chinese, they own the small company, and so it's very hard to catch these things. And so it's not a complete solution, but it helps.
So I do not have answers to all the questions. I think that an issue is about small countries like Norway, how we can fare on our own, addressing, for example, human rights issues, other issues, global regulations generally. Because as a small country, we cannot set the rules, we cannot set the global standards. So the question is, do we need to be on the team of some bigger players like the EU? So we don't need always, for example, when you have a well-defined global arena, let's say the WTO, we have our saying, we can speak, we can influence the process, and there will be some global regulation. But in many fields, there is no such forum. And then the power politics plays a bigger role. And in a couple of areas, Norway have kind of ceded the right to do foreign policy to the EU. That's in the air traffic and some food standards, for example, where you allow the EU to make agreements on behalf of Norway, and Norway participates as an EU member. So as if we were an EU member. So yeah, so that is a kind of issue for the future, whether Norway kind of needs to coordinate with the EU in more areas to have a saying in these areas where we cannot set the rules.
And just one quick one about sustainability and green. It's interesting because going back to the theme at the beginning of ASEM, ASEM has said it has to be green, sustainable, and transparent. And these are the three problems that the EU couldn't sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative's statement in May. So we already see this kind of contradiction. So ASEM says this, and China's part of it. You know, China had to sign on to that. And then BRI has a different set of rules. So maybe over time it will get harmonized. But as we've seen recently with research, 89% of the projects on the Belt and Road have gone to Chinese companies. So it's up to the Chinese companies really to follow these norms.
All right, a few more questions. You've been very patient.
Yes, thank you for a very good presentation. My name is Marcus Lorentzen. I'm from the University of Oslo, Faculty of Law. And I have a question. It's maybe regarding the more strategic approach to the Arctic Belt and Road Initiative. Because it's about a month ago since they released their policy paper, I think. And I think I can see like a different approach to the on-land Belt and Road Initiative and the maritime one. And I'm just wondering, because regarding the on-land land one, you will see that they will invest more and more in infrastructure maybe, and also you highlighted that it might not be as cost-effective as maybe the Chinese would hope. So maybe their motivation is more regarding influence in the area more than maybe the economical one. And then my question goes to, so the maritime one, is it the same approach? Will they invest in infrastructure, free ports maybe, or is it more about an Arctic presence in the region? Yeah.
I think both Teresa and Yun probably are fit to jump in. Who wants to go first?
Sure. On the issue of the Arctic, well, first of all, coming to Chinese investment in the maritime Silk Road, there is this strategic assessment that the maritime Silk Road is more strategic than the Silk Road economic belt because it's actually through the marine expansion or the maritime expansion can China expand its global strategic influence. So I think from the very beginning, the 21st century maritime Silk Road has been perceived with more of a strategic connotation to it, especially if you look at China's so-called string of pearls in the Indian Ocean, which has annoyed India tremendously. But coming to the port development, I mentioned three ports, so the Gwadar, Hambantota, and Jiaoping Special Economic Zone, the Jiaoping Deep Sea Port. So two of them were built, they were developed by Chinese companies as contractors. But from the very beginning, they were not Chinese projects. So the Chinese were only there. They won the bid. So they built the Hambantota for Sri Lankan government and for the Pakistani government. And in the case of the Gwadar port, the port after completion was managed by a Singaporean management company. And I think in the case of the Sri Lankan government, they also hired foreign companies to manage the port. But in both cases, they kept losing money. So in the end, they could not afford to pay the loans anymore, and they reached the deal with the Chinese to let the Chinese run it and let the Chinese have the lease of the land, at least in the case of Hambantota. But then the Jiaoping Deep Sea Port has raised questions in Myanmar as well whether China is trying to develop a naval base in Jiaoping. And that's why the Burmese Navy has been strongly against the development of Jiaoping Port. But in terms of other ports, we hear the talks from China that China will want to invest in Manila, in Indonesia, in Malaysia to build more ports in the region. I just have not seen as much coming out of that direction yet. But coming back to the issue of the polar Silk Road, the Chinese has a very interesting, I call it an identity crisis coming to, or identity struggle coming to its polar policy. Because if you look at the white paper, the Arctic white paper from January of this year, The Chinese actually understand very well they're not an Arctic country. They're what they call the near Arctic country. So when you look at how they define their national interest, there's a very interesting concept. It's called the dynamic interpretation of national interest in the Arctic. So they have certain interests that they want to pursue, but they're uncomfortable with the lack of legal ground for them to claim that, oh, we actually have this much national interest that we want to pursue in the Arctic. So for them, the first thing is that they do need a partner. They need a strong Arctic country to support what they're trying to do. And Russia has turned out to be that ideal candidate in the Arctic. And the fact that they are using the northern route as almost a priority of China's Arctic policy is impressive. But on the other hand, it also raises a question as for how fast or how rapidly they can push forward with their plan. Because building infrastructure in that part of the world is not as easy as building a port in Southeast Asia. So in some of the Chinese policy statements and the analysis by Chinese government experts, we do see that they are acknowledging that one, cooperation with Russia is going to be very time consuming, and two, to build the infrastructure in that part of the region is also going to be time consuming. So I think what they have is a long game. It's not looking at the immediate return or the immediate benefits for China, but by having more assets and having more buying in the region, according to their dynamic interpretation of national interest, they can expand the scope of what they want to claim.
Okay. Well, this will be a really interesting contradiction now that's going to play out because, for example, in the South China Sea, China has ignored the UNCLOS decision, and many scholars have said they might live to regret that because Russia can pull the same thing on them in the north, in the Arctic. And so this contradiction for their short-term interests of their near abroad and their long-term strategy to be able to go through the Arctic, this could be a big stumbling point because we've seen, as you mentioned, the cost. How much does this cost? Now, Russia is doing cabotage, saying that, you have to rent our icebreaker and you have to, you need to check in with us at these different points, so that the Russians kind of are saying that it's their sovereign territory. And if other ships kind of follow that, but you're a lawyer, so I don't want to, you're making me nervous now. But this is a question. It's uncharted territory. This is a new area. How is this going to play out? How will the international laws work? Are they high seas? Are they, how is this going to play out? And I think China will be creating a lot more research centers. So we see, ironically, Europe is not an observer at the Arctic at all because they have some issues, and China is. So China is so this is another interesting way that China has, friends in high places. So they're there. So it's very impressive what China's been able to do. And let's see. So I think the key issue now is with Russia and China. How is this going to play out? Because Russia is extremely sensitive about any sort of, but it's a paradox because they need Chinese money to develop. We see this with offshore projects. What's it called? I'm sorry. Yamal. Yamal. So this is a contradiction. So Russia, we call it, their strategy now is last man standing. So whenever I go to a conference and a Russian comes up to me, they're like, how's the Chinese economy? They're really, they're just waiting. They're hoping things, they're really in a difficult situation. And I'm fascinated to watch what's going on with Russia-China relations and how they're going to play out in the Arctic, but it's very early to say.
No, I will just add one sentence to this, that the politics follow the commodity prices to some extent. So as long as the budgets are filled up, you can afford this kind of infrastructure project. So for countries like Russia, you would expect some kind of fluctuations over time on the eagerness.
All right, time is up. We have loads more questions that we could be asking, but we always feel too bad about keeping people in here for too long, especially when it gets close to lunch. But we will be discussing more about ASEM, what ASEM can do and what we could do to make even ASEM a more effective meeting place. But we'll take that over lunch. Thank you to our speakers who have traveled far and beyond and focused and paid attention. And then to all of you guys who have come here and made it an enjoyable event. And NUPI has lots of exciting seminars and workshops coming up, so pay attention and welcome back. It's all right, right?
Very good question.